Victorian England, 1848. The iron wheels of progress thundered across the countryside as railway lines stitched together a nation in transformation. In the heart of Manchester, where factory smoke mingled with morning mist, Miss Helena Ashford sat in the drawing room of what had once been her family's proud townhouse. Now it was stripped nearly bare, the furniture sold piece by piece to pay creditors her late father had left behind. The letter trembled slightly in her gloved hands, though whether from cold or trepidation she could not say. The fire in the grate had dwindled to embers. Coal was now a luxury they could ill afford. "Is it truly our only option, Helena?" her younger sister Beatrice asked from the window seat, her voice small and frightened. At 17, Beatrice still possessed the innocent hope that somehow their circumstances might miraculously improve. Helena folded the letter carefully, her movements precise despite the turmoil in her heart. "Mr. Thornton has made his offer clear. He requires a wife who can navigate society on his behalf. In exchange, he will settle father's debts, provide mother with a comfortable income, and ensure your debut season proceeds as planned. But you don't love him. You've never even met him properly." "Love is a luxury we can no longer afford," Helena said, the words tasting of ash in her mouth. She was 29, well past the age when romantic dreams seemed anything but foolish. "Mr. Thornton is wealthy beyond measure. His railway investments have made him one of the richest men in England. And one of the most despised by polite society," her mother added quietly from her chair by the dying fire. Mrs. Ashford had aged 10 years, in the 6 months since her husband's sudden death had revealed the extent of his financial ruin. "The son of a coal merchant, Helena, your father would turn in his grave." Helena felt a flash of uncharitable anger toward her father, who had gambled away 3 generations of Ashford prosperity on ill-conceived investments and foolish wagers. But she kept her voice gentle. "Father's wishes are no longer our primary concern, Mother. Our survival is." The harsh truth silenced the room. They all knew how precarious their position had become. Without Helena's marriage to someone of means, they would be destitute within months. The modest house they now occupied was rented, and even that was beyond their dwindling resources. "When is the wedding to be?" Beatrice asked, tears glittering in her eyes. 3 weeks hence. Mr. Thornton wishes the matter settled quickly. He has business in London that requires—" Helena paused, choosing her words carefully. "That requires a wife who can represent him appropriately." What she didn't say was that James Thornton needed to enter into circles that had always been closed to him. Despite his fortune, he remained an outsider, too rough, too common, too tainted by the smell of coal and industry. The old families whispered that you could take the man out of the mines, but you couldn't wash the coal dust from his soul. Helena Ashford, however, despite her circumstances, still carried a name that opened doors. Her grandfather had been an earl's younger son. Her mother's family could trace their lineage back to the conquest. She had been educated by governesses, presented at court, invited to every respectable drawing room in London. It was, she thought bitterly, the only currency she had left to spend. The meeting was arranged for the following Tuesday at the offices of Thornton and Associates, located in a gleaming new building near the railway terminus. Helena dressed with particular care, choosing a walking dress of deep burgundy wool that had somehow escaped the creditors. It was 3 years old, but still fashionable, and the colour brought out the warmth in her chestnut hair. Her maid, Susan, the last remaining servant they could afford, fussed with her bonnet. "You look every inch a lady, Miss Helena." "That is rather the point," Helena replied, studying her reflection. She saw a woman with clear grey eyes, a determined chin, and the kind of understated elegance that came from breeding rather than expenditure. She would not apologise for who she was, even to a man who could buy and sell her family 100 times over. The offices of Thornton and Associates hummed with purposeful energy. Clerks hurried between desks piled high with contracts and surveys. Telegraph machines clicked urgent messages. The whole place smelled of ink, ambition, and coal smoke. A severe-looking secretary escorted Helena through the bustling main room to a private office at the far end. She caught glimpses of maps on the walls, showing railway lines spreading across England like a vast mechanical web. "Miss Ashford," the secretary announced, opening a heavy oak door. The office beyond was spacious and surprisingly refined. Books lined one wall, not just ledgers, but volumes of poetry and history. A large window overlooked the railway yard, where locomotives hissed and thundered. And behind an enormous mahogany desk stood James Thornton. Helena had expected someone older, coarser, marked by his common origins in obvious ways. Instead, she found herself facing a man perhaps 35, tall and powerfully built, with dark hair and striking hazel eyes that seemed to catalogue her worth in a single sweeping glance. He was handsome, she realized with surprise, in a way that suggested raw capability rather than aristocratic refinement. His clothes were impeccably tailored, his cravat perfectly tied, but there was something untamed about him nonetheless. A sense of barely contained energy, of a man who had fought for everything he possessed and would fight again to keep it. "Miss Ashford." His voice was deep, his accent betraying northern origins, despite obvious attempts to smooth its edges. "Thank you for coming." He did not bow, she noticed. Instead, he gestured to a chair positioned before his desk, with the casual command of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Helena settled into the offered seat, her back straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She would not be intimidated, no matter how this man's gaze seemed to pierce straight through her modest attire to the desperation beneath. "Mr. Thornton." He remained standing, studying her with the same assessing look he might give a horse at auction or a property he was considering purchasing. Helena felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her expression composed. "I assume your solicitor has explained the terms," he said finally, moving to pour himself a measure of whiskey from a crystal decanter. He did not offer her any, whether from rudeness or adherence to propriety, she couldn't determine. "He has. You wish to marry quickly and quietly. In exchange for my name and social connections, you will settle my father's debts and provide for my mother and sister." "Precisely." He took a drink, his eyes never leaving her face. "I need a wife who can move in circles that remain close to me. Someone who knows which fork to use, which families matter, how to host a dinner that doesn't become fodder for drawing room mockery." The brutal honesty of it stole her breath for a moment. At least he wasn't pretending this was anything other than a transaction. "And what precisely do you hope to gain from these circles?" Helena asked, finding her voice. "Beyond the proper silverware placement?" Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps that she would question him directly. "Influence, contracts. There are railway routes that require parliamentary approval, bills that need aristocratic support. I've built an empire through hard work and smart investments, Miss Ashford, but I've learned that in England, money alone doesn't open certain doors." "You need respectability," Helena said. "I need what you have," he corrected. "A name that matters, family connections, the kind of polish that can't be bought or learned." Helena met his gaze steadily. "And in return, I receive financial security and the restoration of my family's standing." "You receive," he said, setting down his glass with a sharp click, "approximately £50,000 worth of debt settlement, a London townhouse, an annual income for your mother of £800, and a debut season for your sister that will ensure she makes a proper match." The sums were staggering, more than Helena had dared hope for. "You are generous, Mr. Thornton." "I am practical, Miss Ashford." He moved around the desk to stand uncomfortably close. "I pay well for the value received. Your family name and social position are worth every penny to me." Helena forced herself not to shrink from his proximity. This close, she could smell leather and coal smoke, along with something sharper, ambition, perhaps, or the metallic tang of barely suppressed power. "I should make something clear before we proceed," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "This marriage will be a business arrangement, nothing more. I require your social expertise and your presence at necessary functions. Beyond that, we shall maintain separate lives." The words should have brought relief. Instead, Helena felt an unexpected sting of something like disappointment. "I shall have my own household," she asked carefully. "You shall have the London townhouse to manage as you see fit. I spend most of my time travelling between railway sites or here in Manchester. When I'm in London, we'll maintain appearances, but I have no interest in—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I have no interest in the usual expectations of marriage." "You mean children," Helena said directly, refusing to play at maidenly ignorance. His jaw tightened. "Eventually, perhaps, an heir will be necessary. But that is a matter for the distant future. For now, this is purely a contractual relationship. You'll never be more than a business arrangement, Miss Ashford. I want to ensure you understand that from the beginning." The coldness in his voice was like a physical blow, but Helena had learned to hide her wounds behind a mask of composure. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Thornton. You need not concern yourself that I harbour any romantic illusions." Something flickered in his eyes again, that same flash of surprise, or perhaps respect. "The wedding will take place 3 weeks from Friday," he said, returning to his desk. "At St. George's, Hanover Square. Small ceremony, immediate family only. We'll have a wedding breakfast afterward at the Langham Hotel. I've reserved the private dining room. Appearances must be maintained." "Of course." "After the wedding, you'll move into the London house immediately. I've instructed my housekeeper to staff it according to your direction. You'll receive an annual allowance of £3,000 for your personal use and household expenses." £3,000. It was more money than Helena had ever commanded in her life. "That is most generous," she managed. "It's adequate," he corrected. "I expect you to dress appropriately, maintain the house to proper standards, and entertain as necessary. The allowance reflects those requirements." For the next hour, they discussed the practical arrangements with the same brisk efficiency one might apply to a business merger. Guest lists were reviewed, financial settlements documented. Helena found herself oddly grateful for Mr. Thornton's blunt approach. At least there would be no pretense, no false sentiment to navigate. As she rose to leave, he spoke again. "Miss Ashford." She turned at the door. "I meant what I said about the nature of this arrangement. I have no room in my life for emotional entanglements or romantic expectations. This is business, purely business. I wanted to ensure you understood that completely." Helena lifted her chin slightly, meeting his challenging gaze with her own steady one. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Thornton, and I hope you understand that I am entering this arrangement with clear eyes and no expectations beyond those outlined in our contract. I require no false sentiment from you, only the respect due to the woman who will bear your name and represent your interests in society." For the first time, something like approval crossed his face. "I believe we understand each other, Miss Ashford." "I believe we do, Mr. Thornton. Good day." As the carriage carried Helena back through Manchester's industrial streets, she stared out at the smoking factories and bustling crowds. In 3 weeks, she would become Mrs. James Thornton, wife to a railway baron who had made it abundantly clear she would never be anything more than a convenient tool for social advancement. She pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching the city blur past. This was the trade she was making, her name, her breeding, her social standing, all in exchange for financial security and the salvation of her family. "You will never be more than a business arrangement," he had said. Very well, Helena thought, squaring her shoulders. If that was how James Thornton wanted to conduct this marriage, she would prove herself the most valuable business partner he had ever acquired. She would open doors, navigate society, and build the respectability he craved with the same determined efficiency he brought to building his railway empire. And she would do it all while maintaining her dignity, her pride, and her self-respect. She had already lost her fortune and her future prospects. She would not lose herself as well. The carriage rumbled onward through the grey afternoon, carrying Helena toward a future she had never imagined, a future bound to a man who saw her only as a means to an end, in a marriage that promised everything except the one thing she had once dreamed of finding: love. 3 weeks later, Helena stood before a mirror in a borrowed bedroom at her mother's house, studying her reflection in her wedding gown. The dress was beautiful, ivory silk with delicate lace at the sleeves and collar, far finer than anything she could have afforded herself. Mr. Thornton's money had paid for it, just as his money had paid for everything else. "You look like a queen," Beatrice whispered, tears streaming down her young face. Helena reached out to squeeze her sister's hand. "Don't cry, dearest. This is a happy occasion." But was it? As the carriage carried her to St. Cy, George's church, Helena felt as though she were travelling to her own execution rather than her wedding. The ceremony passed in a blur of ritual words and formal gestures. James Thornton stood beside her, imposing in his dark suit, and recited his vows with the same impersonal precision he might use to read a contract. When the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, her new husband's kiss was perfunctory, a brief, cool press of lips that held no warmth whatsoever. The wedding breakfast at the Langham was an elegant affair, though Helena noticed the subtle social dynamics at play. Her mother's family attended out of obligation, their expressions carefully neutral. Mr. Thornton's guests, business associates and fellow railway investors, regarded the aristocratic attendees with a mixture of deference and resentment. Two worlds colliding, Helena thought, watching the uncomfortable mingling. And I am the bridge between them. James Thornton made a brief speech thanking everyone for attending, his words formal and completely devoid of any reference to affection or happiness. When it was done, he turned to Helena with the same cool composure. "The carriage is ready to take you to Thornton House," he said. "I'm afraid I must return to Manchester this evening. There's a situation with one of the northern lines that requires my immediate attention." Helena felt a jolt of surprise. "You're leaving? On our wedding day?" "This is what I meant about the nature of our arrangement, Mrs. Thornton. My work cannot wait for social conventions." He paused, perhaps seeing something in her expression. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, will help you settle in. I'll send word when I return to London." And with that, he was gone, leaving Helena standing in the middle of the hotel's grand hall in her wedding dress, a bride abandoned before the celebration had even ended. Her mother appeared at her elbow, her face pinched with disapproval. "Helena, I cannot believe he would—" "It's fine, Mother," Helena interrupted, summoning every ounce of composure she possessed. "Mr. Thornton's business is demanding. I knew that when I accepted his proposal." But as the carriage carried her through London's streets to the townhouse that was now her home, Helena felt the first real tears prick her eyes. She had told herself she expected nothing from this marriage, that she harboured no illusions about James Thornton's cold heart. Yet some foolish part of her had still hoped, perhaps, for basic courtesy. For a wedding night at least, before he disappeared back to his railways and his ledgers. "You will never be more than a business arrangement." He had meant every word. Thornton House stood in Belgravia, an impressive 4-story Georgian structure with pristine white columns and iron railing. It was the kind of house Helena's family would have owned before their fall. Elegant, expensive, quietly announcing the wealth of its inhabitants. Mrs. Davies awaited at the door, a stout woman with iron-grey hair and a face that suggested she had seen everything and judged most of it wanting. She curtsied formally as Helena approached. "Mrs. Thornton, welcome to your new home." Your new home. The words felt strange, foreign. This grand house with its gleaming marble floors and crystal chandeliers was now hers to command, at least in her husband's absence. The housekeeper led her through a series of beautifully appointed rooms, explaining the household routine in clipped, efficient sentences. Staff of 12. Dinner at 7. Breakfast served in the morning room. Master's study to remain undisturbed in his absence. Mr. Thornton keeps somewhat irregular hours when he's in residence, Mrs. Davies explained as they climbed the grand staircase. His work often requires very early departures or late arrivals. He prefers not to disturb the household. I see, Helena said, though she was beginning to realize she saw very little about her new husband at all. The chambers assigned to her were in the east wing, a spacious bedroom, a private sitting room, and a dressing room, all decorated in shades of blue and cream. They were lovely, impersonal, and notably far from the master's quarters. Mr. Thornton's rooms are on the opposite side of the house, Mrs. Davies said, confirming what Helena had already surmised. He felt you would appreciate the privacy. Privacy, what a pleasant euphemism for complete separation. That night, Helena sat alone in her beautiful blue bedroom, still wearing her wedding dress, because her maid had not yet arrived from her mother's house with her other belongings. She looked down at the gold ring on her finger, a simple band, chosen by Mr. Thornton's solicitor, not by the man himself. Mrs. James Thornton, Helena Thornton. She was a wife in name only, bound to a man who had made it abundantly clear he had no interest in her beyond her social utility. She had known this, agreed to it, even told herself it was preferable to the alternative of poverty and disgrace. But sitting alone in the darkness, abandoned on her wedding night, Helena allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she might have had, for the marriage built on affection, not contracts, for the husband who might have stayed. Then she rose, carefully removed her wedding dress, and hung it in the wardrobe. Tomorrow she would begin learning how to be Mrs. James Thornton, wife to a railway baron who saw her as nothing more than a useful acquisition. She would play her role flawlessly, she decided. She would be the perfect society wife, opening doors and smoothing his path into circles that had always excluded men like him. She would manage his household with impeccable taste, host dinners that became the talk of London, and represent his interests with grace and intelligence. And if some foolish part of her heart whispered that perhaps in time she might earn more than his cold indifference, well, she would simply have to silence that voice. James Thornton had been clear about the terms of their arrangement. It was time Helena accepted them fully. The weeks following the wedding settled into a strange pattern. James Thornton remained in the north, managing his railway concerns, while Helena established herself in London society. She discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she had a talent for the work. Her first task was to host a small dinner party for 8 carefully selected guests who represented key connections Mr. Thornton needed. She chose her mother's cousin, Lord Pemberton, who sat on several parliamentary committees related to railway regulation. She invited Lady Ashworth, whose late husband had been a railway investor and whose opinions carried weight in society. The guest list was a strategic masterpiece. The dinner was a triumph. Helena wore a gown of midnight blue silk, her grandmother's pearls at her throat, a perfect balance of elegance and restraint. The conversation flowed smoothly, guided by her practiced hand. By the time dessert was served, Lord Pemberton was discussing specific railway bills with genuine interest, and Lady Ashworth was remarking that perhaps Mr. Thornton had been unfairly maligned by those who didn't understand modern commerce. Helena sent her husband a brief letter detailing the evening's success. His response came 3 days later. Mrs. Thornton, your dinner arrangements proved most productive. Lord Pemberton has agreed to meet regarding the Manchester extension. Well done. I shall be in London next Thursday for 2 days. Please arrange a dinner for 12. Suggested guests listed below. J. Thornton. No warmth, no gratitude beyond the perfunctory well done, as if she were a clerk who had filed papers correctly. Helena folded the letter carefully, ignoring the small pang of disappointment. This was the marriage she had agreed to. She would simply have to accept it. When James Thornton finally returned to London, Helena barely saw him. He arrived late on Wednesday evening, closeted himself in his study to review papers, and appeared at breakfast only long enough to confirm the dinner arrangements before departing for a series of business meetings. Helena observed him across the breakfast table, noting details she hadn't registered during their brief previous encounters. He ate quickly, efficiently, barely tasting his food. His clothes were impeccable but showed signs of travel, a crease in his coat, dust on his boots. He read correspondence while eating, his attention divided between contracts and coffee. A man who never stopped working, she realized. A man driven by something more than mere ambition. "The guest list for tomorrow's dinner is finalized," she said, waiting for a pause in his review of documents. "Lord and Lady Westmere have accepted, as have the Honourable Thomas Fairfax and his wife. I've also included Mr. Blackwood from the banking committee and—" "Excellent," he interrupted, not looking up. "I trust your judgment on these matters." It was the closest he had come to a compliment. That evening, Helena found him in his study, surrounded by maps and surveys. She had come to discuss menu arrangements, but found herself pausing in the doorway, observing him in this element. He had removed his coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing surprisingly muscular forearms, evidence that he had not always worked behind a desk. His dark hair was dishevelled, as if he'd been running his hands through it in frustration. He was tracing a route on one of the maps with intense concentration, muttering calculations under his breath. "Mr. Thornton," she said softly. His head snapped up, and for just a moment she saw something raw in his expression. Exhaustion, perhaps, or some deeper strain. Then his usual mask of cool composure slid back into place. "Mrs. Thornton, was there something you needed?" "Only to confirm the menu for tomorrow's dinner. I thought perhaps lamb, but if you have a preference—" "Whatever you think appropriate," he said dismissively, already returning his attention to the maps. "You've proven quite capable at such arrangements." Helena should have left. Instead, she found herself moving closer, her curiosity overcoming her caution. "What are you working on?" He glanced up, surprised by the question. "A new route through the Pennines. The engineering is complicated, the terrain is difficult, and the existing surveys are inadequate." "May I see?" His eyebrows rose slightly, but he gestured to the map spread across his desk. Helena came around to study it, seeing lines and calculations that meant little to her, but recognizing the ambitious scope of what he was planning. "You mean to connect Manchester to Newcastle through the mountains?" she said, tracing the proposed route with her finger. "Eventually, yes. It will cut travel time by nearly half and open new commercial routes." His voice had changed, she noticed, becoming animated in a way it never did when discussing social obligations. The profits alone would be substantial, but more than that, it would prove the viability of mountainous routes. Other investors have said it's impossible. "But you don't believe them," Helena said. "I believe most things are possible with proper engineering and sufficient determination." He met her eyes directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. The word impossible is generally used by those who lack imagination. There was something compelling about him like this, passionate, engaged, fully present in a way he never was during their few interactions. Helena found herself curious about this man she had married, this driven stranger who spoke about railway lines the way poets spoke of beauty. "How did you come to railways?" she asked. "Your father was in coal, wasn't he?" Something shuddered in his expression. "He was. I started in the mines at 12 years old. Spent 6 years underground before I had sense enough to realize I'd either find a way out or die there." Helena felt a jolt of shock. She had known he came from common origins, but somehow she hadn't imagined anything quite so harsh. "You worked in the mines? As a child?" "Most boys did in our town. It was the only work to be had." His voice had gone flat, carefully neutral. "I taught myself to read at night, studied mathematics by candlelight. When I was 18, I talked my way into a position as a surveyor's assistant for the railway company that was extending lines through Lancashire. I learned everything I could, saved every penny, and made my first investment at 22. "And now you're one of the wealthiest men in England," Helena said softly. "Now I employ 5,000 men across 6 railway lines," he corrected. "Wealth is merely a byproduct of building something that matters." It was the most he had ever revealed about himself, and Helena sensed the conversation was costing him something, a vulnerability he rarely allowed. She wanted to ask more, to understand what drove him, what demons pursued him. But before she could speak, his expression closed again. "I should return to these calculations," he said, a clear dismissal. Tomorrow's dinner is important. I trust you have everything in hand. The moment of connection, if it had existed at all, was over. Of course, Helena said, maintaining her composure. I'll leave you to your work. As she returned to her own chambers, Helena found herself thinking about the boy who had worked in coal mines, who had clawed his way out of darkness through sheer determination and intelligence. What scars did such an upbringing leave? What did it do to a person to fight so hard for everything they achieved? Perhaps James Thornton's coldness wasn't cruelty, but armor, protection built against a world that had never shown him gentleness. The thought followed her into sleep and lingered in her dreams. The dinner party the following evening cemented Helena's growing reputation as an exceptional hostess. She had transformed the Thornton House dining room into an elegant showcase, with hothouse flowers arranged in crystal vases and candlelight gleaming off the polished silver. James Thornton appeared promptly at 7, impeccably dressed in evening attire, his hair groomed and his expression set in pleasant neutrality. He greeted guests with practiced courtesy, and Helena noted how he had learned to smooth the rough edges from his accent, to modulate his voice to match the refined tones around him. He was performing, she realized. Just as she was performing, they were both playing roles, presenting carefully constructed versions of themselves to a world that judged everything by appearances. Throughout the meal, Helena guided the conversation with subtle skill, directing topics toward railway investments and parliamentary concerns, creating opportunities for James to showcase his expertise without seeming to push. She watched him relax incrementally as he discussed routes and tonnage, his natural intelligence and passion evident to anyone listening. Lord Westmere, initially sceptical, was soon leaning forward with genuine interest. You've actually calculated the cost per mile for mountain routing. I'd be very interested to see those figures. I can have them sent to you tomorrow, James said, and Helena saw a flash of triumph in his eyes, quickly masked, but unmistakable. She felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction. This was why he had married her, to create moments exactly like this, where doors opened and opportunities materialized through social connections rather than mere money. After dinner, as the men retired for port and the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, Lady Westmere regarded Helena with newfound respect. You've done very well for yourself, Mrs. Thornton, she said, her tone suggesting she had expected far less. I must confess, when I heard about your marriage, I thought, well, never mind what I thought. Mr. Thornton is clearly far more refined than his reputation suggested. My husband is exceptionally intelligent and dedicated, Helena said carefully. He simply hasn't had the opportunity to demonstrate those qualities in the right circles. And you are providing that opportunity, Lady Westmere observed shrewdly. Very clever, my dear, very clever indeed. When the guests had finally departed and the house fell silent, Helena found James in his study once more. He was pouring himself a whiskey, his shoulders relaxed in a way they rarely were. That went well, he said, gesturing with his glass toward her. Lord Westmere has agreed to introduce me to the committee chairman. That dinner alone may have secured the parliamentary support we need for the Pennines route. I'm glad it proved useful, Helena said. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. You're very good at this, better than I anticipated. It wasn't quite praise, more like a merchant acknowledging that goods delivered had exceeded quality expectations. Yet coming from James Thornton, Helena suspected it was as close to a compliment as he offered. I understand what you need, she said simply. Access, respectability, connections. I can provide all of that. Yes, he said, still watching her with that assessing gaze. You can. A silence stretched between them, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. Helena found herself studying his face in the lamplight. The strong jaw, the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the mouth set in habitual determination. He was handsome, she thought, not for the first time. But more than that, he was compelling in a way she hadn't expected. There was depth beneath his cold efficiency, complexity behind his calculated demeanour. "I will return to Manchester tomorrow," he said, breaking the silence. "There's a crisis with one of the suppliers that requires my personal attention." "Of course," Helena said, ignoring the small pang of disappointment. "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks, perhaps 4. I'll send word of any entertaining that needs to be done." He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "You've managed the household admirably, Mrs. Thornton. Mrs. Davies speaks very highly of your organisation." It was the most personal acknowledgement he had ever given her, and Helena felt a small, foolish warmth bloom in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, then turned back to his papers, the conversation clearly over. Helena left him to his work, climbing the stairs to her lonely chambers, with mixed feelings churning in her heart. She was succeeding at being Mrs. James Thornton. She was proving her value, fulfilling the terms of their arrangement. But with each small success, with each glimpse of the complicated man beneath the harsh exterior, she felt herself slipping into dangerous territory. She was beginning to care. Not love, not yet, perhaps not ever, but genuine interest, curiosity, even a sort of tentative affection for this driven, damaged man who had fought his way up from coal mines to command an empire. It was foolish, she told herself, as she prepared for bed. James Thornton had been absolutely clear about the nature of their marriage. She would never be more than a business arrangement to him, a useful tool for achieving his ambitions. She needed to remember that, needed to protect her heart from hoping for something he had promised would never exist. But as she lay awake in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, Helena couldn't quite silence the small voice that whispered, "What if? What if, despite everything, there was a chance?" The months that followed established Helena as one of London's most sought-after hostesses. Invitations to Thornton House became coveted commodities, for Helena had mastered the art of bringing together unlikely combinations of guests: old aristocracy and new money, politicians and industrialists, artists and investors, in ways that created unexpected alliances and profitable connections. James returned to London periodically, staying for days or occasionally a week before departing again for Manchester, Liverpool, or Newcastle. Each visit followed the same pattern. He would review her entertainment plans, attend necessary functions, and then disappear back into his world of railways and contracts. Yet Helena noticed small changes. He began asking her opinion on matters beyond dinner parties: which politicians might support specific legislation, which families held influence in certain regions, and how to approach delicate social negotiations. She realized he was coming to trust her judgment, to see her as something more than merely decorative. One evening in late autumn, Helena was reviewing household accounts in the morning room when James appeared unexpectedly in the doorway. She looked up in surprise. He wasn't due back from Manchester for another week. "Mr. Thornton, I didn't know you were returning today." The situation in Manchester resolved faster than anticipated. He looked exhausted, his clothes rumpled from travel. "I apologize for arriving without notice. This is your home. You need never apologize for being here." Helena set aside her papers. "Have you eaten? I can have Mrs. Davies prepare something." "I ate on the train." He hesitated in the doorway, as if uncertain whether to enter or retreat. "What are you working on?" "The quarterly accounts. I've been reviewing household expenditures and looking for areas where we might economize." His eyebrows rose. "Economize? I've given you a substantial allowance." "Which I appreciate. But I've found several vendors charging premium rates simply because they assume all railway money is spent carelessly. By negotiating directly and reviewing contracts carefully, I've reduced monthly costs by nearly 15% without sacrificing quality." James moved into the room, picking up the ledger she'd been working in. He scanned her neat columns, her detailed notes, her careful calculation. Something shifted in his expression. "You've been doing the accounts yourself? I assumed you'd leave such matters to Mrs. Davies." "Mrs. Davies is excellent at managing staff. But financial oversight requires different skills. Helena felt slightly defensive. My father may have been a poor investor, but he ensured I understood mathematics and bookkeeping. He said a woman from a good family should be capable of managing an estate's finances if necessary. Your father was right. And James continued examining the ledger, his finger tracing her calculations. These savings are significant. Over a year, we're talking about hundreds of pounds. £647, based on current projections, Helena said. I thought perhaps those savings could be directed towards something productive, rather than simply padding vendor profits. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something like genuine respect in his eyes. You've been thinking about the business. I've been thinking about efficiency. Isn't that what you do? Find ways to maximize return on investment. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his usually stern features. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him, and the effect was startling. He looked younger, less burdened, almost boyish. Indeed it is, Mrs. Thornton. Indeed it is. He pulled up a chair beside her, the first time he had ever voluntarily sat in her company outside of formal meals or social obligations. Show me what else you've found. For the next hour, they reviewed the accounts together, Helena explaining her reasoning, James offering insights from his own business experience. The conversation flowed easily, naturally. Both of them engaged in a shared task that transcended the usual awkwardness between them. You have a head for this, James said eventually, leaning back in his chair. Have you ever considered that these same principles could apply to larger operations? What do you mean? The railway companies I invest in. Most are poorly managed from an operational standpoint. The engineering is sound, but the administrative costs are excessive. Someone with your eye for inefficiency could identify substantial savings. Helena felt a flutter of excitement. You're suggesting I review railway accounts? I'm suggesting that the skills you've demonstrated here could be applied more broadly. He studied her face. Would that interest you? Very much, Helena admitted. I find I enjoy the challenge of solving such puzzles. James nodded slowly, as if making a decision. Then perhaps you'd be willing to review the accounts for the Manchester-Liverpool line. The costs have been escalating, but I haven't been able to identify the source. A fresh perspective might prove valuable. It was the first time he had invited her into his professional world, the first time he had suggested she might contribute something beyond social connections. Helena felt the significance of the moment like a physical weight. I would be honored to help, she said quietly. It's not an honor, he corrected, but his tone was gentle. It's work. Tedious, detailed work that requires patience and precision. But if you can find the inefficiencies I'm missing, you'll have earned far more than gratitude. What will I have earned? Proof that you're more than just a business arrangement, he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, a moment of genuine connection that neither had anticipated. Then James cleared his throat, breaking the spell. I should clean up from the journey, he said, rising. Perhaps we could discuss this further over dinner. I'll ask Mrs. Davies to prepare something special, Helena said. After he left, Helena sat motionless for several minutes, her heart beating faster than usual. Something had shifted between them tonight, some small crack in the wall James had built around himself. She was being given a chance to prove herself in his world, to demonstrate value beyond her social connections and household management. It was an opportunity she hadn't expected and didn't intend to waste. That evening's dinner was a private affair, just the two of them at the large dining table. James had changed into fresh clothes and looked more rested, though the shadows under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Tell me about the Manchester-Liverpool line, Helena said, once the first course was served. What makes you suspicious about the accounts? James seemed pleased by her directness. The revenue projections have been met consistently, but the profit margins keep shrinking. Someone is either incompetent or dishonest, and I need to determine which. How long has this been occurring? 6 months? Perhaps 7? Gradual enough that it wasn't immediately obvious, but significant enough that it's now affecting our overall returns. Helena considered this. In my experience, gradual increases often indicate systematic problems rather than simple theft. A thief would take larger amounts more sporadically. This sounds like structural inefficiency or poor oversight. That's my suspicion as well, but I haven't been able to prove it. They discussed the technical details of railway operations throughout the meal, and Helena found herself fascinated by the complexity of managing such an enterprise. Thousands of employees, multiple supply chains, maintenance schedules, regulatory requirements. It was like managing 100 households simultaneously. "I can see why you spend so much time traveling," she observed. "This isn't something that can be managed from London." "No," James agreed. "Railways require constant attention. A single breakdown can cascade into massive losses. Equipment failures, labor disputes, supply shortages, any of these can cripple operations if not addressed immediately." "It must be exhausting." He looked at her with surprise, as if no one had ever acknowledged the toll his work took. "It's necessary." "That doesn't make it less exhausting," Helena said gently. James was quiet for a moment, turning his wineglass between his fingers. "I suppose it is," he finally admitted. "But I can't afford to slow down. The moment I do, competitors will overtake me, or operations will decline, or—" He stopped himself. "Or you'll remember what it was like before you had all this," Helena finished softly. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp and defensive. "What do you mean by that?" "Only that success born from desperation carries its own burdens," she said carefully. "You fight so hard to rise above your beginnings that you can never allow yourself to rest, for fear of falling back." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Helena worried she had overstepped, presumed too much understanding of a man she barely knew. Then James set down his wineglass and said, very quietly, "You're perceptive, Mrs. Thornton." "I've had my own experience with falling," Helena replied. "Perhaps that helps me recognize the fear in others." "Is that what you think I am? Afraid?" "I think we're all afraid of something. The question is whether we allow that fear to control us, or whether we acknowledge it and move forward, regardless." James studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what are you afraid of, Helena?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a small shock through her system. "I'm afraid," she said slowly, choosing honesty over safety, "of living a life of elegant emptiness, of being nothing more than an ornament in a beautiful house, useful only for opening doors and making pleasant conversation, while my mind withers from disuse." "Is that how you feel here? Like an ornament?" "Not tonight," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Tonight, I feel like a partner in an interesting conversation. It's the first time since our marriage that you've spoken to me, as if I might have something valuable to contribute beyond social graces." James flinched slightly. "I've been dismissive." "You've been consistent with the terms of our arrangement," Helena corrected. "A business relationship, nothing more. I understood what I was agreeing to. And yet you're disappointed nonetheless. I'm human, Mr. Thornton. Understanding the terms intellectually doesn't prevent one from hoping, occasionally, for something more." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Helena half expected him to retreat behind his usual cold formality, to remind her that such hopes were futile. Instead, he said, "I've spent so many years building walls that I've forgotten how to let anyone pass them." "Why did you build them in the first place?" James was silent for so long that Helena thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, he began to speak. "When you grow up the way I did, poor, hungry, watching your father drink away what little money the family earned, you learn early that vulnerability is dangerous. Caring about things, about people, only gives the world more ways to hurt you." His voice was low, almost emotionless, but Helena heard the pain beneath the control. "I watched my mother work herself to death trying to keep us fed. She died when I was 14, worn out at 36. My father blamed me, said if I hadn't been such a useless boy, If I'd worked harder in the mines, she wouldn't have had to take in washing to make ends meet. Helena felt her chest tighten with sympathy. That's unconscionable. You were a child. I was old enough to work, therefore old enough to be responsible. James's jaw was tight. After she died, I decided I would never be powerless again. Never be in a position where I couldn't protect myself or depend on anyone else. I would build something so strong, so unassailable, that nothing could ever hurt me again. And did it work? Helena asked softly. Has your empire made you invulnerable to pain? His laugh was bitter. No, it's only made me isolated, wealthy and isolated. It doesn't have to remain that way, doesn't it? He met her eyes, and she saw genuine confusion there. I don't know how to be any different, Helena. I don't know how to let people in without feeling like I'm giving them power to destroy me. Perhaps, Helena suggested carefully, you might start by letting one person in, just a little, and see what happens. You mean you. I'm your wife. I'm already in your life, whether you want me there or not. The question is whether I remain a stranger who happens to share your name, or whether we might become something more. James stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the darkened street. Helena waited, her heart pounding, uncertain whether she had pushed too far. I married you for practical reasons, he said finally, his back to her. Because I needed social connections, respectability, a wife who could navigate the world I was barred from entering. Those reasons haven't changed. No, Helena agreed. But people can change. Relationships can evolve beyond their original terms. Can they? He turned to face her, his expression conflicted. Or is that just a romantic fiction we tell ourselves? I suppose we'd have to try it to know for certain. He studied her for a long moment, and Helena forced herself to hold his gaze, to let him see the sincerity in her eyes. I don't know if I'm capable of what you're suggesting, he said quietly. Neither do I, Helena admitted. But perhaps we could learn together. James crossed back to the table, but instead of sitting, he stood beside her chair. Slowly, as if the gesture required immense effort, he extended his hand. Helena placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm, evidence of years of hard labor that no amount of wealth could erase. His grip was warm, strong, and for the first time since their wedding, it felt like a genuine connection rather than a perfunctory social gesture. I can't promise anything, he said. I'm not asking for promises, only possibility. He nodded slowly, then lifted her hand and pressed a brief kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that was both formal and surprisingly intimate. I'll have the Manchester-Liverpool accounts sent to you tomorrow, he said. If you find what I'm looking for, perhaps we'll discuss expanding your role in the business operations. And if I don't find it, a ghost of a smile touched his lip, then you'll have proven yourself thorough enough to review the next line's accounts. Either way, you'll be working. It wasn't a declaration of affection or even friendship, but it was something, an opening, a tentative step toward the possibility Helena had suggested. As she prepared for bed that night, Helena found herself smiling at her reflection. The woman looking back at her appeared different somehow, more purposeful, more alive than the desperate bride who had accepted a loveless marriage to save her family. She was building something here, brick by careful brick. Not a romance, perhaps, but a partnership. A genuine connection with a complicated man who had spent his life protecting himself from exactly the kind of vulnerability she was offering. It would take time. It would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to meet him where he was, rather than demanding he become someone different. But for the first time since her wedding day, Helena felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The accounts arrived the next morning, 3 large ledgers and numerous boxes of receipts, invoices, and correspondence. Helena cleared the morning room table and spread the documents out systematically, approaching the task as she would a complex puzzle. For 3 days, she immersed herself in the numbers, barely leaving the room except to sleep. She traced expenditures, cross-referenced invoices with receipts, and built detailed spreadsheets comparing costs across different time periods. James was in London during this time, though occupied with meetings and other business. But each evening he would stop by the morning room to check on her progress. "Found anything?" he would ask. "Not yet," Helena would reply. "But I'm getting closer." On the fourth day, she found it. It wasn't theft or embezzlement, as she had suspected. Instead, it was a cascading series of small inefficiencies in the supply chain. The railway had contracted with multiple vendors for similar materials, paying premium rates to each. Meanwhile, a single clerk responsible for coordinating deliveries had been systematically routing shipments through unnecessary intermediaries, not for personal gain, but because he didn't understand the cost implications of his decisions. No single transaction was suspicious enough to trigger alarm, but together they represented a hemorrhage of thousands of pounds annually. Helena documented everything meticulously, creating a detailed report with recommendations for consolidation and improved oversight. She was putting the finishing touches on her analysis when James returned that evening. "I found your problem," she announced without preamble. His eyebrows rose. "Show me." For the next hour, Helena walked him through her discovery, explaining the pattern she'd uncovered and the systemic changes needed to prevent future waste. James listened with complete attention, occasionally asking sharp questions that tested the thoroughness of her research. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, staring at the report she'd prepared. "This is excellent work," he said finally. "Better than I could have done myself, and certainly better than my accountants managed." "It simply required looking at the whole system rather than individual transactions," Helena said, trying to contain her pleasure at his praise. "It required intelligence, diligence, and analytical skill," James corrected. "Don't diminish what you've accomplished." He stood and began pacing, his mind clearly racing through implications. "If this pattern exists in the Manchester-Liverpool line, it likely exists in others. We need to review all the major routes, implement standardized procurement procedures, improve oversight of middle management." Helena watched him think aloud, fascinated by how quickly his mind moved from problem to solution. This was James Thornton in his element, not the cold, formal man who attended dinner parties, but the brilliant strategist who had built an empire from nothing. "I'll need help implementing these changes," he said abruptly, turning to face her. "The work you've done here, could you replicate it for the other lines?" "I believe so, yes. It would require significant time, weeks, possibly months of detailed analysis." "I have the time," Helena said, "and I find I quite enjoy the work." James studied her face, his expression serious. "This isn't a casual request, Helena. If you take this on, you'll be actively managing a significant aspect of my business operations. It would mean real responsibility, real authority. I'd expect the same standards from you that I'd expect from any of my senior managers." "I understand." "Do you?" He moved closer, his intensity almost overwhelming. "Because this changes things between us. If you become integral to my business, you're no longer just a wife providing social connections. You're a partner, a colleague, someone I depend on professionally." "Would that be so terrible?" Helena asked quietly. "It would be complicated," James said, "mixing business and marriage, professional partnership and personal relationship. Lines would blur, expectations would shift. Perhaps that's not entirely bad." He looked at her for a long moment, and Helena saw the conflict in his eyes, the desire for her assistance warring with his fear of allowing her closer. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "What you've done here is exceptional, and I'd be a fool not to utilize your skills. But I need to consider the implications carefully." "Of course," Helena said, trying not to let her disappointment show. James must have seen it anyway, because he added more gently, "I'm not refusing, Helena. I'm simply recognizing that accepting your help means acknowledging you as more than I originally intended. That's not a decision to make lightly." After he left, Helena remained in the morning room, surrounded by ledgers and reports. She understood his hesitation. Accepting her as a business partner would fundamentally alter their arrangement. It would require him to see her differently, to trust her in ways he had deliberately avoided. But she had proven herself capable. She had demonstrated value beyond her social connections. And whether James Thornton was ready to admit it or not, they had already begun to move beyond the cold business arrangement they had started with. The question was whether he would allow that evolution to continue, or whether his fear would drive him back behind the walls he had built so carefully. Helena could only wait and see which impulse would win. 2 days later, James summoned Helena to his study. She found him standing by the window, his expression unreadable as he watched the street below. "I've made a decision about your proposal," he said without preamble. Helena's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes? I'm accepting your offer to review the other railway line. You've proven yourself more than capable, and I'd be a fool to let pride prevent me from utilizing such valuable skills." He turned to face her. "However, there will be conditions." "What conditions?" "First, this is a professional arrangement. You'll be compensated for your work, a salary commensurate with what I'd pay any senior analyst." Helena felt a flicker of surprise. "You want to pay me? I insist on it. If you're doing the work of a professional, you'll be treated as one. Your allowance remains separate. That's for household management. This would be earned income for business services rendered." "That's very generous." "It's fair," James corrected. "Second condition, you report directly to me, but your findings and recommendations will be presented to my board of directors. They'll need to understand that these changes come from sound analysis, not wifely influence." "I understand." Third, and here his expression grew more serious, "if we're going to work together professionally, we need clearer boundaries between business and personal matters. When we're discussing railway operations, I'm your employer, not your husband. Can you accept that distinction?" Helena considered carefully. He was offering her meaningful work, real authority, and professional respect. All things she desperately wanted. But he was also reinforcing the separation between them, making it clear that this partnership would remain strictly business. "I can accept it," she said finally. "Though I hope you understand that the line between professional and personal isn't always as clear as we might wish." Something flickered in his eyes. "No, it isn't. Which is why we must be deliberate about maintaining it." Over the following weeks, Helena threw herself into the work. James provided her with accounts from the Leeds-Bradford line, and she discovered similar inefficiencies to those she'd found in Manchester-Liverpool. Her recommendations saved the company thousands of pounds and streamlined operations significantly. Word spread through James's organisation about the mysterious analyst who was revolutionising their procurement systems. Most assumed she was a new hire from London's financial district. Few knew she was the boss's wife, working from the morning room of Thornton House. Helena found the work intellectually stimulating in ways she'd never experienced. For the first time in her life, she was using her education for something beyond managing a household or making pleasant conversation. She was solving complex problems, making decisions that affected thousands of workers, contributing meaningfully to an enterprise that was literally reshaping England's landscape. And she was working closely with James in a way that revealed new dimensions of his character. In professional discussions, he was demanding but fair, quick to praise good work, and equally quick to point out flaws in logic. He treated her as an equal, challenging her reasoning and expecting her to defend her conclusions with evidence. It was, Helena realized with some irony, the most intimate relationship she'd ever had with anyone. Built not on romance, but on mutual respect and intellectual partnership. Their personal interactions, however, remained frustratingly distant. James still maintained separate quarters, still disappeared to the north for weeks at a time, still treated their marriage as a convenient arrangement rather than a genuine union. Yet small things changed. He began joining her for breakfast more regularly. He asked about her day, her thoughts on current events, her progress on various accounts. They developed an easy rhythm of conversation that felt almost like friendship. Almost, but not quite. Because friendship implied equality, and Helena could never quite forget that she was still fundamentally dependent on James's goodwill. He paid her salary, yes, but he could withdraw it at any time. He sought her professional input, but he could dismiss it whenever he wished. She had some power in this relationship, but he held most of it. The imbalance gnawed at her, even as she told herself to be grateful for what she had. The crisis came in late winter, when an unexpected collapse in railway stock prices sent investors into panic. Several of James's competitors faced bankruptcy, and rumours began circulating that Thornton and Associates was similarly overextended. Helena learned of the situation when James arrived home one evening, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. His face was grey with fatigue, his eyes haunted. "What's happened?" she asked, meeting him in the entrance hall. "Market crash," he said tersely. "Railway stocks are plummeting. I've lost over £100,000 in the last week." Helena felt the blood drain from her face. That's catastrophic. It's survivable, but barely." He moved past her toward his study. "I need to review our exposure, determine which investments to liquidate, which to hold. I'll be working through the night. Let me help." He paused, turning to look at her. "Helena, this is beyond account reconciliation. This is crisis management at the highest level. Which is precisely why you need someone you trust reviewing the numbers with you." She moved closer, seeing the doubt in his eyes. "James, I know your operations better than anyone except you. I've reviewed every major line's accounts. I understand the interconnections, the dependencies. Let me help." For a moment, she thought he would refuse, would retreat behind his walls and shut her out. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he nodded. "All right, but we work as professionals. No emotions, no distractions. Clear heads only." They worked through the night and into the next day, surviving on coffee and determination. Helena reviewed financial statements, while James calculated exposure across different investments. They identified which railway lines were genuinely profitable versus which were propped up by inflated stock valuations. The picture that emerged was dire, but not hopeless. James had overextended himself on several speculative northern routes, betting on parliamentary approval that now seemed unlikely. But his core operations, the lines Helena had been optimizing, were fundamentally sound. If you liquidate the speculative positions and consolidate around the profitable core routes, Helena said, pointing to her calculations, you'll take significant losses but avoid total ruin. The companies I've been working with can sustain operations even in a depressed market. James studied her analysis, his exhaustion evident in every line of his face. That means abandoning the Pennines route. 3 years of planning, gone. The Pennines route was ambitious, but the timing was wrong. In a stable market, it would be brilliant. In this market, it's suicide. He was silent for a long time, staring at the maps and calculations spread across his desk. Helena could see the internal struggle, his pride warring with pragmatism, his ambitions colliding with reality. "I've never backed away from a project before," he said finally. "You're not backing away. You're making a strategic retreat to preserve your ability to fight another day." Helena moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "James, you built this empire from nothing. Protecting it during a crisis isn't weakness. It's the same intelligence and determination that created it in the first place." He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw his carefully constructed armor crack completely. The exhaustion, the fear, the crushing weight of responsibility, all of it showed plainly on his face. "If I lose this," he said quietly, "I lose everything. I go back to being nothing." "That's not true," Helena said firmly. "You'll always be the man who climbed out of coal mines through sheer will and brilliance. You'll always have the knowledge, the skills, the drive that built this empire. Losing money doesn't erase who you are. Doesn't it?" His voice was raw. "Everything I am is tied to what I've built. Without it, I'm just the coal merchant's son who got above himself." "No." Helena placed her hand over his on the desk, feeling him tense at the contact. "You're a brilliant strategist, an innovative engineer, and one of the most determined people I've ever met. Those qualities exist independent of your current financial position." James looked down at their hands, his expression conflicted. "You don't understand what it was like, Helena. The poverty, the powerlessness, the constant hunger and fear. I swore I'd never go back to that I'd build something so strong that nothing could ever drag me down again." "And you have," Helena assured him. "Even with the losses you're facing, you'll still be wealthy by any reasonable measure. You won't go hungry. You won't be powerless. You're not that terrified boy in the coal mines anymore." "Then why does it feel like I am?" The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in Helena's chest. Without thinking, she moved closer, placing her other hand on his arm. "Because trauma doesn't respect logic or facts," she said gently. "The fear you felt as a child lives in your bones, regardless of how successful you become. But James, you're not facing this crisis alone. You have resources now that you never had before, including me." He met her eyes, and she saw something shift in their hazel depths. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of trust. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. "This isn't your problem. If everything collapses, you'll be fine." "The marriage settlement protects your family's interests regardless of what happens to my business." "Is that what you think? That I'm only here because of the contract? Isn't that what we both agreed? A business arrangement, nothing more." "Perhaps that's what we agreed," Helena said, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest. "But people change, James. I've changed. These months of working beside you, learning your business, seeing the dedication and brilliance you bring to everything you do, they've changed how I see you, how I see us." "Helena, no, let me finish." She took a breath, knowing she was about to cross a line they could never uncross. "You said I would never be more than a business arrangement, and perhaps you still believe that. But for me, this stopped being just business months ago. Somewhere between the dinner parties and the account reviews, somewhere in all those early morning discussions over coffee and late-night strategy sessions, I started to care about you, not as an employer or a means to financial security, but as a person, as my husband." The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. "You can't," he said finally. We agreed to the terms of a marriage contract," Helena interrupted. "We didn't agree to control our feelings, and mine have evolved whether I wanted them to or not." "This is a mistake." James pulled away from her, putting distance between them. "Emotional attachments complicate everything. They make us vulnerable, cloud our judgment. They also give us strength," Helena countered. "They give us reasons to fight beyond mere self-preservation. James, you're terrified right now not just because you might lose money, but because you've tied your entire identity to your success. You've built walls so high that you can't see over them anymore. You're isolated at the top of your empire, surrounded by employees and competitors, but connected to no one." "That's how it has to be," he insisted. "Caring about people, letting them close, it only leads to pain." "Living without connection leads to a different kind of pain," Helena said. "Loneliness, isolation, the slow death of becoming nothing more than your work. Better that than the alternative." "Is it?" Helena moved closer again, refusing to let him retreat. "James, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to want to love me. I'm simply telling you the truth. I care about what happens to you, beyond how it affects my circumstances. And right now, you're facing a crisis that requires not just financial acumen, but also emotional resilience. You need someone in your corner who isn't there for profit or position. You need an ally who genuinely wants you to succeed. And you claim to be that ally. I don't claim it. I've proven it. These past months, every analysis I've done, every recommendation I've made, they've all been aimed at protecting and growing what you've built. Not because I was contracted to do so, but because I wanted to. Because your success matters to me. James closed his eyes, his jaw working as he processed her words. When he opened them again, the vulnerability she'd glimpsed earlier was back, raw and unguarded. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. How to let someone in without feeling like I'm giving them power to destroy me. Then let's figure it out together, Helena said. One small step at a time, starting with this crisis. Let me stand beside you as we navigate it, not as an employee or a contractual obligation, but as your partner, your wife in the truest sense. And after the crisis, he asked, what then? Then we continue forward, building whatever this relationship is meant to become, without predetermined outcomes or rigid expectations, just two people learning to trust each other. James was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. Partners, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Helena took his hand, feeling the now familiar calluses against her palm. Partners. This time, when he pulled her close, it wasn't a calculated gesture or a perfunctory display. It was genuine, a man reaching out to the one person who had proven herself trustworthy when everything else felt uncertain. They stood like that for several minutes, drawing strength from each other's presence. Then, wordlessly, they returned to the desk and the mountain of work that awaited them. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer employer and employee, or even just husband and wife bound by contract. They were partners in the truest sense, facing crisis together, trusting each other's judgment, building something that transcended mere business arrangement. Over the following weeks, they worked tirelessly to stabilize James's financial position. Helena's analyses proved invaluable, helping him identify which investments to salvage and which to abandon. Her social connections also became crucial, as she leveraged her relationships to secure meetings with potential investors and political allies. Lord Pemberton proved particularly helpful, using his parliamentary influence to advocate for railway regulations that favoured established operators like James over more speculative ventures. Lady Westmere introduced Helena to her banker brother, who provided bridge financing at reasonable rates. Slowly, painfully, James's empire stabilized. He took significant losses, but avoided the catastrophic collapse that had destroyed his competitors. The companies Helena had optimized became the foundation of his rebuilt operations, leaner, more efficient, and ultimately stronger than before. Through it all, their partnership deepened. James began seeking Helena's input, not just on financial matters, but on strategy, personnel decisions, even engineering challenges. He valued her perspective, her analytical mind, and her ability to see problems from angles he might miss. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the walls he had built around himself began to come down. Spring arrived with a sense of renewal. The worst of the financial crisis had passed, and James's railway operations were stabilizing. More importantly, the crisis had fundamentally altered the dynamic between James and Helena. They now worked as true partners, meeting each morning over breakfast to discuss the day's priorities. Helena had become indispensable to the business operations, her analytical insights and social connections proving as valuable as James had initially hoped, and far more so than he had ever expected. But the changes went deeper than professional collaboration. James had begun to open up about his past, sharing stories about his childhood in fragments during their evening conversations. Helena learned about his mother, a gentlewoman who had taught him to read, despite his father's objections, that education was wasted on mining families. She learned about the 6-year-old boy who had carried his father home from the pub more times than he could count, and the teenager who had sworn he would build a life where such humiliations could never touch him again. In turn, Helena shared her own history, not just the public narrative of her family's fall, but the deeper truths. Her father's gambling addiction and the lies he'd told to cover his losses. Her mother's willful blindness to their deteriorating circumstances. The desperate scramble after his death, when creditors circled like vultures and former friends suddenly became unavailable. We're both survivors, James observed one evening as they sat in the library, a fire crackling in the grate. You survived your family's collapse just as I survived the mines. We know what it means to fight for survival. Perhaps that's why we work well together, Helena said. We both understand that security is precious because we've known its absence. Hey, James looked at her across the chessboard they'd been playing on, a new ritual they'd developed during the crisis. When I married you, I thought I was acquiring a social asset, a means to an end. And now I wonder how I ever functioned without you. He moved his knight, capturing her bishop. You've become essential, Helena, not just to the business, but to... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. To my life. Helena's breath caught. It wasn't a declaration of love, but from James Thornton, it was as close as she'd yet heard. You've become essential to my life as well, she said quietly, more than I ever imagined possible when we made our arrangement. James stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the darkened garden. Helena waited, sensing he was working towards something important. I haven't been fair to you, he said finally. I imposed terms on our marriage that protected me but gave you nothing. I treated you as a business transaction when you deserved to be treated as a person, as my wife. You were protecting yourself, Helena said, rising to join him at the window. I understood that, even when it hurt. Understanding doesn't make it right. He turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. Helena, I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of romance you might have hoped for when you were young. I'm too scarred, too damaged by my past. But I do know that you've become the most important person in my life, and I want to offer you more than we originally agreed to. What are you saying, James? I'm saying that I want this to be a real marriage, not just business, not just partnership, but something genuine. I want to share my life with you, all of it, not just the parts that serve practical purposes. Helena felt tears prick her eyes. I want that too. I've wanted it for months. I know, and I was too frightened to acknowledge it. He reached out, cupping her face with one hand. But the crisis taught me something important. When everything was collapsing around me, when I thought I might lose everything I'd built, the only thing that truly mattered was having you beside me. Your intelligence, yes. Your social connections, certainly. But more than that, your presence, your faith in me, your partnership. You're not alone anymore, James, Helena whispered. You don't have to be. I'm beginning to believe that. He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. May I kiss you? Properly, I mean. Not as a contractual obligation or social display, but because I want to. In answer, Helena closed the small distance between them, pressing her lips to his. This kiss was nothing like the perfunctory touch at their wedding or the brief gestures at social functions. This was real, warm, genuine, and filled with months of suppressed longing. When they finally pulled apart, both were slightly breathless. I should probably tell you, James said, his voice rougher than usual, that I've been falling in love with you for weeks now, maybe months. I kept telling myself it was just respect, or gratitude, or professional admiration. But it's more than that. Much more. Helena felt joy bloom in her chest like spring flowers. I love you too. I think I have since you first showed me those railway maps and your eyes lit up with passion for your work. That was the moment I realized you weren't the cold, calculating man I'd thought. You were someone who cared deeply about things, who felt intensely, even if you tried to hide it. I do feel intensely, James admitted. That's precisely why I've spent so many years trying not to feel at all. It's safer that way. But lonelier. But lonelier. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a gesture that was both protective and vulnerable. I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I'm stubborn, driven, occasionally unreasonable when I'm focused on a problem. I've noticed, Helena said with a smile against his chest. And I have nightmares sometimes. about the mines, about poverty, about losing everything. Then I'll be there when you wake from them. James tightened his embrace. I don't deserve you. That's not for you to decide, Helena said firmly. I chose you, James Thornton. Not the railway baron, not the fortune, not the social position. I chose the man who worked in coal mines and taught himself mathematics by candlelight. The man who builds empires and cares more than he wants to admit. That's the man I love. For a long moment they simply held each other, two people who had come together through desperation and duty, but who had found something far more valuable than either had sought. Come with me, James said finally, taking her hand. He led her through the house to the master wing, the rooms he had occupied alone since their marriage. Helena had never entered them before, respecting the boundaries he had established. The suite was surprisingly personal, filled with maps and books, mechanical drawings and engineering models. This was where James truly lived, where he brought his work and his dreams. I want you here, he said simply, not in the guest wing, separated from me by half the house. Here, where you belong, as my wife, my partner, my love. Helena looked around the room, seeing evidence of the man she had come to know so well. The books on mathematics and engineering, the sketches of railway designs, the small model of a locomotive on the mantel. Are you certain? She asked. This is a significant change from what we agreed. I'm certain that what we agreed was wrong, James said. I was wrong to try to keep you at arm's length. Wrong to think I could treat marriage like a business contract. Wrong to believe I could protect myself from caring by simply refusing to acknowledge what I felt. He moved to a desk drawer and withdrew a small velvet box. I bought this months ago, then told myself I'd never give it to you because that would make things too complicated. He opened the box to reveal a ring, not the simple gold band she wore, but an exquisite piece set with sapphires and diamonds. This was my mother's, James said quietly. The only thing of value she ever owned. My father tried to sell it after she died, but I stole it and hid it. I've carried it with me for over 20 years, promising myself that if I ever loved someone enough to truly marry them, I would give them this ring. Helena felt tears streaming down her face as James took her left hand and gently removed the simple gold. Helena Thornton, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Would you do me the honor of accepting this ring, not as part of a contract or business arrangement, but as a symbol of my love and my commitment to building a real marriage with you? Yes, Helena whispered. Yes, absolutely yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and Helena saw that his hands were trembling slightly. Then he pulled her into his arms again, holding her as if she were something infinitely precious. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared not just a room, but genuine intimacy. Not the perfunctory consummation of a business arrangement, but the loving union of two people who had chosen each other, despite all the barriers between them. As Helena lay in James's arms in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing, she marveled at the journey that had brought them here, from the desperate bride entering a loveless marriage to save her family, to the woman lying beside a man she genuinely loved, a man who loved her in return. You're not sleeping, James murmured against her hair. I'm too happy to sleep, Helena admitted. I keep thinking this might be a dream. If it is, then we're both dreaming of it. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Helena? Yes? Thank you. For what? For not giving up on me, for seeing past the walls I built, for believing there was something worth finding beneath all the armor. Helena turned in his arms to face him, able to see his features dimly in the moonlight filtering through the windows. There was always something worth finding, she said. You just needed someone patient enough to look, and stubborn enough to keep looking even when I tried to push you away. That too, Helena agreed with a smile. They fell asleep tangled together, two people who had built something real from the cold foundations of a business transaction. The following months brought continued transformation, both to their marriage and to their lives. Helena's role in the railway business became official. James made her a partner in Thornton and Associates, granting her actual ownership stake rather than simply employing her as an analyst. The announcement caused some scandal in business circles, But James faced down the criticism with characteristic determination. "Mrs. Thornton has proven herself more capable than most of my male associates," he told the board of directors when they questioned the decision. "She has saved this company hundreds of thousands of pounds through improved efficiency. If you object to her gender rather than her competence, then perhaps you should reconsider your own position on this board." No one resigned. Helena's dual role as society hostess and business partner created a unique position. She could discuss railway engineering over dinner with investors, then seamlessly shift to planning the menu with Lady Westmere. She became known as a woman who bridged worlds, equally comfortable in drawing rooms and boardrooms. More importantly, she and James continued to build their marriage on foundations of respect, partnership, and growing love. They developed rituals and rhythms, morning strategy sessions over breakfast, evening chess games in the library, Sunday walks in Hyde Park discussing everything from politics to poetry. James began sleeping without nightmares, his demons gradually quieting as he learned to trust in the security of their relationship. Helena flourished in ways she had never imagined, her intelligence finally finding full expression in meaningful work. They entertained frequently, their dinner parties becoming legendary for bringing together unlikely combinations of guests: aristocrats and engineers, politicians and artists, old money and new. Helena's social graces combined with James's business acumen created a salon unlike any other in London. One evening, nearly a year after the financial crisis that had transformed everything, they hosted a particularly important dinner. Lord Pemberton was in attendance, along with several other parliamentary leaders who would vote on railway legislation. Also present were the Westmeres, Helena's mother and sister, Beatrice, now happily engaged to a respectable country gentleman, and several of James's key business associates. As Helena watched the dinner unfold, conversations flowing naturally, alliances forming, business being conducted with elegant discretion, she caught James's eye across the table. He smiled at her, a private expression that spoke of shared understanding and deep affection. After the guests departed and they retired to their rooms, James pulled her into his arms. "Do you remember what I said when we first met?" he asked. "You said many things, most of them rather cold. I told you that you would never be more than a business arrangement." "I remember," Helena said quietly. "It hurt, even though I understood why you said it." "I was a fool," James said firmly. "You were never just a business arrangement, even when I tried to convince myself you were. From the moment you stood in my office and met my assessment with dignity rather than submission, you were always going to be more than I bargained for." "Is that a complaint?" "It's gratitude." He kissed her softly. "You saved me, Helena. Not just from financial ruin, but from a life of emotional isolation. You showed me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that connection isn't dangerous, that love is worth the risk." "You saved me too," Helena replied. "You gave me purpose when I thought my life would be nothing but decorative emptiness. You valued my intelligence when society said it was unfeminine. You became a true partner when you could have kept me as an ornament. We saved each other," James corrected. "Built something together that neither of us could have created alone." As they stood in their shared chambers, no longer separated by half a house and a lifetime of fear, Helena reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing but survival, a cold transaction that would secure her family's future at the cost of her own happiness. Instead, she had found partnership, purpose, and profound love with a man who had initially seemed incapable of offering any of those things. "I love you, James Thornton," she said, looking up into his hazel eyes. "And I love you, Helena Thornton, my wife, my partner, my salvation." Their kiss was sweet and full of promise, the promise of years ahead, building an empire and family together. Two people who had started as strangers bound by contract, who had become the truest of partners, and who had finally found in each other the home they had both been seeking. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls of Thornton House as Helena watched from the morning room window. In the garden below, James was chasing their 4-year-old daughter, Margaret, around the fountain, while their 2-year-old son, Thomas, toddled after them both with determination. "Careful, Papa!" Margaret shrieked with delight as James caught her up and spun her around. "You'll make me dizzy." Helena smiled, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their 3rd child grew. She had never imagined that desperate day when she'd agreed to marry a railway baron for financial security, that such joy awaited her. "They're getting mud on their good clothes," Mrs. Davies observed from the doorway, though her tone held more affection than disapproval. The housekeeper had softened considerably over the years, won over by the love that now filled the house. "Let them," Helena said. "Clothes can be washed. Memories like these are precious." James looked up and caught sight of her at the window. He waved, and Helena saw in his face the same love and contentment she felt. The driven, haunted man she had married was still present. He still worked tirelessly on his railway empire, still pushed himself harder than necessary. But the coldness had melted away, replaced by warmth that extended to everyone he loved. Helena returned to her desk, where a detailed analysis of the new Birmingham route awaited her review. Even heavily pregnant, she continued her work as partner in Thornton and Associates. James had insisted on hiring additional analysts to lighten her load, but she refused to step away entirely from the work she loved. "Mrs. Thornton?" A clerk appeared with a telegram. "This just arrived from Manchester. Mr. Thornton asked that you review it immediately." Helena scanned the message and felt a surge of triumph. The Pennines route, the project James had been forced to abandon during the crisis, had finally received parliamentary approval. After 5 years of careful planning and patient negotiation, they could move forward. She rose and moved to the window, watching her husband play with their children. He deserved this victory, deserved to see the dream he'd been forced to defer finally come to fruition. James must have sensed her watching because he looked up again. This time she beckoned him inside, holding up the telegram. Even from this distance she saw his expression change as he understood. Minutes later, he burst into the morning room, slightly out of breath, with both children clinging to him. "The Pennines route?" he asked, hope and excitement warring in his voice. "Approved," Helena confirmed, handing him the telegram. "We can begin surveying immediately. Construction could start by next spring." James read the telegram, then looked at Helena with an expression of pure joy. "We did it. After everything, the crisis, the delays, the opposition, we actually did it." "You did it," Helena corrected. "You never gave up on the dream, even when you had to set it aside temporarily." "We did it," James insisted, pulling her close with one arm while balancing Margaret on his hip. "Every success I've had these past 5 years has been built on the foundation we created together. You're as responsible for this approval as I am. Your social connections, your analysis proving the route's viability, your partnership in every aspect of the business." Thomas tugged on his father's trouser leg, demanding attention. James laughed and scooped him up too, somehow managing to hold both children while keeping his other arm around Helena. "What do you say we celebrate?" he suggested. "A family dinner, just the 4..." He glanced at Helena's belly. "Soon to be 5 of us. No business associates, no social obligations. Just our family." "I'd like that," Helena said, leaning into his embrace. That evening, after the children were in bed, Helena and James sat in the library where they had spent so many evenings over the years. The chessboard sat between them, but neither was paying attention to the game. "Do you ever think about that first meeting?" Helena asked. "In your office, when you told me I'd never be more than a business arrangement?" "Frequently," James admitted, "usually with profound embarrassment at my own stupidity." "You weren't stupid, you were protecting yourself." "I was trying to protect myself," he corrected, "but I was also denying myself the greatest gift I've ever received. Your love, your partnership, your presence in my life." He reached across the board to take her hand, his thumb tracing the sapphire ring she wore, his mother's ring, which had become a symbol of their genuine marriage. "If I could go back to that day, he continued. I would tell my past self that the frightened woman in front of him would become his greatest asset, his truest friend, and the love of his life. That she would save him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. That she would build an empire beside him and fill his house with love and laughter. And what would your past self say to that? Helena asked with a smile. He probably wouldn't believe it. He was too damaged, too convinced that isolation was safety. James lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. But he would have been wrong, as he was wrong about so many things. Helena moved around the table to sit beside him, settling into his embrace. We were both wrong, in different ways. I thought this marriage would be nothing but survival, a cold arrangement that would secure my family's future, but leave me hollow inside. Instead, it became the foundation for the most fulfilling life I could have imagined. You built more than you know, Helena, James said seriously. Not just the railway empire, though your contributions there have been invaluable, but you built a home, a family. You took a house that was just a display of wealth and transformed it into a place of genuine warmth and love. We built it together, Helena insisted. Every decision, every challenge, every triumph, we faced them as partners. Partners, James agreed, the word carrying echoes of that pivotal moment during the crisis when they had first joined hands as true allies. In business and in life. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low in the grate. Outside, London carried on its endless activity, railways crisscrossing the nation James had helped connect. Society continuing its elaborate dance of propriety and ambition. But inside Thornton House, two people who had found each other against all odds sat wrapped in the quiet contentment of genuine love. A love built not on passion or convenience, but on respect, partnership, and the slow, steady work of learning to trust. I love you, Helena said quietly. And I love you, James replied, his arms tightening around her. My wife, my partner, my greatest triumph. It was, Helena thought, the perfect summary of what they had built together. Not a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience, but a genuine partnership that had transformed both their lives. She had come to him desperate and afraid, selling her name for security. He had received her coldly, certain he wanted nothing more than social utility. But together, through patience and determination, they had built something neither had anticipated. An empire, yes, but more importantly, a love that had redeemed them both.